Girl, grab your coffee and get comfy because I am about to spill the most epic tea about this Persian queen who literally saved her entire people. Like, we're talking palace drama, beauty pageants, secret identities, and a plot twist that would make your favorite Netflix series jealous. Trust me, by the end of the story, you're going to be obsessed with Queen Esther. Okay, bestie, let me set the scene for you because this story is absolutely wild from the very beginning. We're talking about ancient Persia, like way back in the day, around 486 BC to be exact. Picture the most extravagant empire you can imagine, stretching from India all the way to Ethiopia. We're talking 127 provinces, honey. And ruling over all of this magnificence was King Xerxes. But in the Hebrew, they called him Ahasuerus, which honestly sounds way more dramatic, don't you think? Now, this king, girl, he was extra, with a capital E. Like, imagine the most over-the-top person you know. Multiply that by 1,000, and you've got King Ahasuerus. This man threw parties that lasted for months, not days, not weeks, months, darling. So picture this. It's year 3 of his reign, and this king decides he wants to flex on absolutely everyone. He throws this massive banquet for all his officials, servants, army officers, nobles, and provincial governors. The party goes on for 180 days. That's literally 6 months of nonstop celebrating. Can you even imagine? Your girl gets tired after a weekend music festival, but these people were partying for half a year straight. And honey, the decorations were everything. We're talking white cotton curtains with blue cords, silver rings, marble pillars, gold and silver couches on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. This wasn't just a party. This was a production. The king was basically saying, look at my wealth, look at my power, bow down to my glory. Very much giving, look at my Pinterest board come to life energy. But wait, it gets better. After those 180 days, the king throws another party, this time for all the people living in the capital city of Susa, from the greatest to the least. This one lasted 7 days, and it was held in the garden court of the royal palace, because apparently 6 months of partying wasn't enough. Now, while all this is happening, Queen Vashti is doing her own thing. She's hosting her own banquet with the women in the royal palace. Smart girl, she knew her audience and was giving the ladies their own space to celebrate. I'm imagining it was probably way more elegant and refined than whatever chaos the men were getting into. But here's where the drama really starts. And girl, when I tell you, this next part had me gasping. Okay, so it's day 7 of the second party, and the king is feeling himself. Actually, scratch that. He's feeling himself, and he's had way too much wine. The Bible literally says his heart was merry with wine, which is biblical speak for this man was drunk. So, what does our intoxicated king decide to do? He wants to show off his beautiful queen to all his party guests, but not in a sweet, like, look at my amazing wife kind of way. Oh no, honey. He wants her to come wearing her royal crown, and according to some interpretations, only her royal crown. Girl, he literally wanted to parade his wife around like a trophy for all these drunk men to gawk at. Now, let me paint this picture for you. Imagine you're Queen Vashti. You're hosting your own elegant gathering with your friends, probably having deep conversations, maybe doing some ancient Persian version of girl talk. You're in your element, being the hostess with the mostess. And then suddenly, 7 drunk men, the king's eunuchs, show up at your party with this absolutely ridiculous request from your husband. The audacity, the disrespect, the sheer nerve! And you know what Queen Vashti did? She said no. Just straight up refused. Girl said, I don't think so. Can you imagine the silence that must have fallen over both parties when the messengers had to go back to tell the king that his queen had refused him? Now, I need you to understand something about ancient Persian culture. Women did not refuse their husbands, especially when that husband was the king of the most powerful empire in the world. This was literally unheard of. Vashti knew exactly what she was risking, and she chose her dignity anyway. But King Ahasuerus, oh honey, he was livid. His ego couldn't handle being told no, especially in front of all these important people he'd been trying to impress for months. The Bible says he became furious and burned with anger. Picture a toddler having a meltdown because someone said they couldn't have candy, except this toddler had absolute power over millions of people. So, what does he do? He calls in his advisors, his wise men who understood the times, which sounds fancy, but really they were just his yes men who told him what he wanted to hear. And these men, probably scared out of their minds because they'd never seen their king this angry, started feeding into his rage. The head advisor, this guy named Memucan, basically said, "Your Majesty, this is bigger than just Queen Vashti disrespecting you. If word gets out that the queen refused the king's command, every woman in the empire is going to think they can disobey their husbands too." Girl, the fragility, the insecurity. These men were literally terrified that women might start standing up for themselves. So Memucan suggests this absolutely drastic solution. He's like, "King, you need to make an example out of Queen Vashti. Issue a royal decree that she can never come before you again and give her royal position to someone better." And you know what? The king loved this idea. It appealed to his wounded pride and his need to maintain control. So he sent out letters to every province in their own language and script, declaring that Queen Vashti was banished and that every man should be the ruler in his own household. Can we just pause here for a second? This man threw away his marriage because his ego couldn't handle being told no. Queen Vashti lost everything, her position, her home, her future, because she refused to be objectified. And the saddest part? The king probably regretted it the moment his hangover wore off, but by then it was too late. Persian law was unchangeable once it was written down. I imagine Queen Vashti packing her things, holding her head high, even though her heart was probably breaking. She'd stood up for what was right, but the cost was everything she'd known. But honey, sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price, and Vashti was willing to pay it. Now, after the king's anger cooled down, which probably took a while because men like this don't get over their tantrums quickly, he started remembering Vashti. The Bible says he remembered what she had done and what had been decreed against her. I bet he was sitting in that big empty palace, missing his wife, but too proud to admit he'd made a mistake. That's when his servants, probably seeing their king getting all mopey, suggested something that would change the course of history. Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces to gather all these beautiful young women to the harem in Susa. And let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Basically, they suggested the ancient world's most high-stakes beauty pageant. Girl, little did they know they were about to set in motion God's most incredible rescue plan. Now, this is where our real heroine enters the story, and honey, her introduction gives me chills every time. Living in Susa was this Jewish man named Mordecai, and let me tell you about this man's heart because it's beautiful. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and his great-grandfather had been carried away from Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar took all the Jewish people into exile. But here's what makes Mordecai special. He had adopted his cousin's daughter after her parents died. This little orphan girl's name was Hadassah, but she went by her Persian name, Esther. And girl, when I tell you this woman was stunning, the Bible says she was beautiful in form and features. But I know it was more than just physical beauty. There was something special about Esther, something that drew people to her. Now, when the king's decree went out for this empire-wide beauty search, guess who got swept up in it? Our girl, Esther. I can only imagine how terrifying this must have been for her. One day she's living quietly with her adoptive father Mordecai, and the next day she's being taken to the royal palace to compete for the chance to become queen of the most powerful empire in the world. But here's where it gets interesting. And this shows you just how wise Mordecai was. Before Esther left, he told her something crucial. Don't tell anyone you're Jewish. Don't reveal your nationality or family background. Now, this might seem sneaky, but Mordecai understood something important about the times they were living in. Anti-Semitism was real, and revealing her Jewish identity could put not just Esther, but their entire community at risk. So Esther arrives at the palace, and she's placed under the care of Hegai, who was in charge of the women's quarters. And honey, this man took one look at Esther and knew she was special. The Bible says she pleased him and won his favor. Hegai immediately gave her beauty treatments, special food, and 7 chosen maidservants from the king's palace. He even moved her and her maids to the best place in the house of the women. Girl, when God's favor is on your life, doors open that you never even knew existed. Now, let me tell you about this preparation process because it was intense. These women had to go through 12 months of beauty treatments before they could even meet the king. 12 months, bestie. That's a full year of the most luxurious spot treatments you can imagine. The first 6 months were oil of myrrh treatments. Myrrh was super expensive and was used for purification and to make skin incredibly soft and fragrant. Then the next 6 months were perfumes and cosmetics. We're talking about the ancient world's most exclusive beauty regimen. But while all the other women were probably obsessing over their treatments and plotting how to catch the king's attention, I think Esther was using this time differently. She was watching, learning, and preparing not just her body, but her mind and heart for whatever God had planned for her. And every day, Mordecai would walk in front of the court of the women's quarters to find out how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. This adoptive father was so protective and loving, he couldn't bear not knowing if his daughter was okay. Now, here's what I love about Esther during this time. When it was finally her turn to go to the king, she didn't ask for anything extra. All the other women probably loaded up on jewelry, expensive clothes, and accessories, trying to make themselves stand out. But Esther? She only took what Hegai advised her to take. She trusted his wisdom and didn't try to be someone she wasn't. And honey, that confidence and authenticity was everything. When Esther went to King Ahasuerus in the royal house, something amazing happened. The Bible says the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. Like, it wasn't even close. This man fell head over heels for our girl. He set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then he threw another party, because remember, this king loved his parties, called Esther's Banquet, for all his officials and servants. He even proclaimed a holiday throughout all the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So Esther is now queen, living her best life in the palace, but she's still keeping her Jewish identity secret, just like Mordecai advised. And speaking of Mordecai, this man was working as a government official sitting at the king's gate, which was basically like being part of the royal court. Now, girl, this is where the story gets really interesting, because God starts weaving all these threads together in the most incredible way. While Mordecai is doing his job at the king's gate, he overhears something absolutely shocking. 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the door, were plotting to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Can you imagine? Mordecai is just minding his own business, doing his work, when he accidentally discovers a plot to murder the king, who happens to be his adopted daughter's husband. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. So what does Mordecai do? He immediately tells Queen Esther, and Esther reports it to the king, giving Mordecai full credit for discovering the plot. The king investigates, finds out it's true, and has both conspirators hanged. And here's the important part. This whole incident gets written down in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so Mordecai saved the king's life and got proper credit for it. That's nice. But honey, hold on to that thought, because this seemingly small detail is going to be crucial later in our story. God was already setting up his rescue plan, even though nobody knew it yet. Meanwhile, life in the palace goes on. Esther is settling into her role as queen, probably learning the ins and outs of royal life, building relationships, and navigating palace politics. She's still keeping her Jewish identity secret, but she's also staying connected to Mordecai, who continues to check on her and guide her. Now, this is where our story gets a villain, and honey, he is awful. King Ahasuerus promotes this man named Haman the Agagite, which is important because the Agagites were ancient enemies of the Jewish people. The king elevates Haman above all the other officials, basically making him the most powerful person in the empire after the king himself. And what does the king decree? That all the royal servants at the king's gate should bow down and pay homage to Haman whenever he passed by. Basically, everyone had to worship this man like he was a god. Everyone, that is, except Mordecai. Girl, when I tell you the drama that ensued, every single day, Haman would walk through the king's gate and everyone would bow down to him. Everyone except Mordecai, who would just stand there, refusing to bow. The other servants kept asking him, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" But Mordecai wouldn't budge. Now, why wouldn't Mordecai bow? It wasn't because he was being stubborn or disrespectful. It was because, as a faithful Jew, he believed in only worshiping God. Bowing down to Haman would have been like idol worship to him, and he couldn't compromise his faith, even if it meant risking his life. But Haman, this man's ego was fragile. At first, he probably just noticed that one person wasn't bowing and it annoyed him. But when he found out it was the same person every single day, and that person was Jewish, girl, he lost his mind with rage. The Bible says that when Haman saw that Mordecai didn't bow down or pay him homage, he was filled with wrath. But here's where it gets truly evil. Haman didn't just want to hurt Mordecai. He thought it was beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He wanted to destroy all the Jewish people throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus. Let that sink in for a moment. This man wanted to commit genocide because one person wouldn't bow down to him. The level of evil, the pure hatred, it's almost incomprehensible. So Haman starts plotting, and honey, he goes about it in the most calculated, evil way possible. In the first month of the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, Haman cast lots, called pur in their language, to determine the best day to carry out his genocidal plan. He was basically rolling dice to decide when to murder an entire people group. The lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, which was the month of Adar. So now Haman had his date, and he started putting his plan into motion. He goes to King Ahasuerus with this incredibly manipulative speech. He says, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." Girl, the manipulation in this speech is next level. First, he doesn't even name the Jewish people. He just calls them a certain people, making them sound mysterious and threatening. Then he accuses them of not keeping the king's laws, which was a lie designed to make them sound like rebels. And finally, he offers to pay for their destruction out of his own pocket, 10,000 talents of silver, which was an absolutely massive amount of money. And you know what King Ahasuerus did? This man, who should have been protecting all his subjects, regardless of their ethnicity or religion, just handed over his signet ring to Haman and said, "The money and the people are given to you, to do with them as seems good to you." Just like that. No investigation, no questions about which people group Haman was talking about, no concern about the morality of what he was proposing. The king literally gave Haman permission to commit genocide and didn't even want the money for it. So the decree was written and sealed with the king's ring, making it unchangeable according to Persian law. Letters went out to all the provinces with orders to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, little children and women, on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, and to plunder their possessions. The letters went out by couriers, and when the decree was proclaimed in Susa, the whole city was in confusion. Can you imagine? One day everything is normal, and the next day there's a government-sanctioned order to murder your Jewish neighbors, co-workers, and friends? The Bible says that the king and Haman sat down to drink after sending out this decree. Girl, the callousness. They're casually having drinks while planning the destruction of innocent people. Meanwhile, the entire city of Susa was perplexed, which tells you that most people knew this decree was wrong and couldn't understand how their leaders could do such a thing. But while the king and Haman are toasting their evil plan, guess what's happening in the Jewish community? When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, crying out with a loud and bitter cry. This man was in absolute anguish, not just for himself, but for his entire people. And he wasn't alone. In every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The entire Jewish community was in despair, facing what seemed like certain death. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Esther is in the palace, probably going about her royal duties, when her maids and eunuchs come and tell her about Mordecai. They don't know why he's in mourning, just that he's outside the king's gate, wearing sackcloth and ashes, and crying out loudly. Esther is deeply distressed by this news. She sends clothes to Mordecai, trying to get him to take off the sackcloth, but he refuses. Something is seriously wrong, and she needs to find out what it is. So she calls for Hatshak, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and commands him to go to Mordecai and find out what's going on and why he's acting this way. Hatshak goes out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate, and honey, what Mordecai tells him is devastating. He explains everything, how Haman had promised to pay silver into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews, the exact amount he'd offered, all the details of this evil plot. And then Mordecai does something that literally gives me chills every single time I read it. This man, who has loved and protected Esther her whole life, has to give her some of the hardest truth she's ever heard. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Girl, let me unpack this for you, because Mordecai is saying several profound things here. First, he's telling Esther that being queen won't save her. When Haman's decree goes into effect, the executioners aren't going to care about her royal status. If they find out she's Jewish, and they will eventually, she's gonna die with everyone else. Second, he's expressing his faith that God will save the Jewish people somehow, even if Esther chooses not to act. Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. He's basically saying, God will find a way to save us, with or without you. But then comes the line that absolutely wrecks me every time. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai is suggesting that maybe, just maybe, God orchestrated all the events of Esther's life to bring her to this exact moment. Maybe her parents dying, maybe being adopted by him, maybe being chosen for the beauty competition, maybe winning the king's heart, maybe becoming queen. Maybe it was all part of God's plan to position her to save her people at this crucial moment in history. For such a time as this, those words echo through history, don't they? They speak to divine purpose, to the idea that our lives aren't just random collections of events, but that God is weaving our stories together for purposes we might not even understand yet. Esther receives Mordecai's message, and I can only imagine the internal battle she must have fought. On one hand, there's the very real possibility of death if she approaches the king uninvited. On the other hand, there's the certainty of death for herself and all her people if she does nothing. But you know what our girl decides? She chooses courage over comfort, purpose over safety, faith over fear. Esther sends this message back to Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Susa and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Girl, the faith and determination in this message. Esther isn't just going rogue. She's asking for her entire community to pray and fast for her for 3 days. She understands that what she's about to do requires divine intervention, and she wants all of God's people interceding for her. And that last line, if I perish, gives me goosebumps every time. Esther has counted the cost and decided that some things are worth dying for. Saving her people is worth the risk. So Mordecai goes and does everything Esther commanded him. Can you imagine those 3 days? The entire Jewish community in Susa, fasting and praying, knowing that their queen is about to risk everything to save them. The weight of an entire people's hope and desperation focused on one woman's courage. And Esther in the palace, fasting with her maids, preparing not just physically, but spiritually for what might be the most important moment of her life. Praying for wisdom, for favor, for courage, and for God to be with her when she takes that terrifying walk into the king's presence. On the 3rd day, Esther puts on her royal robes and stands in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house. So when Esther appears in the court, he can see her immediately. This is the moment of truth. Will he hold out the golden scepter, or will he order her execution for approaching without permission? And honey, what happens next is pure divine favor in action. When the king sees Queen Esther standing in the court, she finds favor in his sight. The Bible says that the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approaches and touches the top of the scepter. Can you imagine her relief? The man she thought might order her death instead welcomes her with the symbol of life and favor. But then the king asks her something interesting. He says, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom." Half the kingdom, girl. That's how pleased the king was to see his queen. But notice that he doesn't just ask what she wants. He asks what she wishes and what her request is. It's like he can sense that she didn't just come for a casual chat. He knows she has something important on her mind. Now, here's where Esther shows her wisdom and strategic thinking. She doesn't just blurt out, "Please don't let Haman kill all the Jews." Instead, she says, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." A banquet? Girl, she's playing the long game here. She's going to wine and dine both the king and Haman before she makes her big request. Smart strategy. People are always more receptive when they're relaxed and well-fed. So the king immediately calls for Haman to come quickly so they can attend Esther's banquet. Can you imagine Haman's surprise? One moment he's going about his day, probably gloating about his evil decree, and the next moment he's being summoned to a private banquet with the king and queen? At the banquet of wine, the king again asks Esther about her petition and request, promising her up to half the kingdom, but Esther still doesn't reveal her true purpose. Instead, she says, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Another banquet? She's inviting them to come back tomorrow. Now, some people might think Esther was stalling or being indecisive, but I think she was being incredibly wise. She was waiting for the perfect moment, and she understood that timing is everything. Maybe she sensed that the king wasn't in the right frame of mind yet. Maybe she wanted to build more anticipation. Maybe she was waiting for God to align all the circumstances perfectly. Whatever her reasoning, it was about to pay off in the most incredible way. So Haman goes out from the banquet feeling absolutely amazing about himself. He's thinking, I'm so important that the queen invited me to a private banquet with just her and the king, and she's invited me back tomorrow too? I must be the most favored person in the entire empire. But then as he's walking through the king's gate on his way home, he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai still doesn't stand up or show him any respect. Girl, this just ruins Haman's entire good mood. All that joy from being honored by the queen just evaporates because one person won't bow to him. Talk about being controlled by your ego. That's when his wife Zeresh and all his friends give him the worst advice ever. They say, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. 50 cubits is about 75 feet high, honey. They're suggesting he built a gallows that's basically an 8-story building just to make sure everyone in the city can see Mordecai's execution. The vindictiveness, the pure evil of it all. And Haman loves this idea. He immediately has the gallows built, probably staying up all night to make sure it's ready. He's planning to ask the king first thing in the morning to have Mordecai hanged, and then he'll go to Esther's second banquet in the best mood ever. But girl, what Haman doesn't know is that God is about to flip this entire script in the most dramatic way possible. That very night, the night before Haman planned to ask for Mordecai's execution, something interesting happens. King Ahasuerus can't sleep. The Bible says the king could not sleep, and honey, I believe this insomnia was divinely appointed. So what does the king do when he can't sleep? He calls for the book of the records of the Chronicles to be brought and read to him. Now, this might sound boring to us, but remember these Chronicles contained all the important events of his reign. It was like his royal diary or historical record. And guess what passage they just happened to read to the sleepless king? The account of how Mordecai had discovered the plot by Bigthan and Teresh to assassinate the king. You remember that incident from earlier in our story that seemed like just a small detail? Well, it's about to become huge. The king asks, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And his servants tell him, nothing has been done for him. Nothing! Can you believe this? This man saved the king's life and he never received any reward or recognition for it. The king realizes he has a serious oversight to correct. So the king asks, who is in the court? And wouldn't you know it, Haman has just entered the outer court of the king's house to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared. The timing is absolutely incredible. Haman is there to ask for Mordecai's death right at the moment the king discovers he needs to honor Mordecai for saving his life. The king's servants tell him that Haman is waiting in the court, so the king says, let him come in. Girl, imagine Haman's excitement. He thinks the king is summoning him early because he's just so important and favored. He's probably thinking this is the perfect opportunity to ask for Mordecai's execution before the day even officially begins. So Haman comes in, and the king immediately asks him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" And honey, Haman's ego just takes over completely. He thinks to himself, who would the king delight to honor more than me? So he starts describing the most lavish honor ceremony he can imagine, basically everything he's ever dreamed of having for himself. He says, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then let him ride on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Girl, he's basically describing a royal parade. He wants the king's own clothes, the king's own horse, and one of the most important nobles leading him through the city while announcing his honor to everyone. In his mind, he's already picturing himself in this royal procession, soaking up all the glory and adoration. But then the king says something that absolutely shatters Haman's world. "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have suggested." Mordecai the Jew, the very man Haman wants to execute, is the man the king wants to honor. And not only that, but Haman himself has to be the one to carry out this honor ceremony. Can you imagine the look on his face? One moment he's on top of the world thinking he's about to be celebrated in the most magnificent way possible. The next moment he discovers he has to honor his worst enemy using the exact ceremony he designed for himself. So Haman has to take the robe and the horse, array Mordecai, and lead him on horseback through the city square, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Picture the scene, honey. Haman, who had built a 75-foot gallows to hang Mordecai, is now walking through the streets of Susa leading Mordecai's victory parade. The man he wanted to destroy is being celebrated as a hero, and he has to be the one announcing it to everyone. The humiliation must have been unbearable for someone as prideful as Haman. But the irony? It's absolutely divine justice. After this incredibly humbling experience, Mordecai returns to the king's gate, but Haman hurries to his house, mourning and with his head covered. Girl, this man is in complete despair. His world has been turned upside down in a matter of hours. When Haman tells his wife Zeresh and all his friends what happened to him, they give him some prophecy that he probably didn't want to hear. "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but surely fall before him." Even his own advisors are telling him that he's picked a fight he can't win. But before Haman can fully process this devastating news, the king's eunuchs arrive to hurry him to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Can you imagine his state of mind as he's being rushed to this second banquet? Just that morning, he woke up thinking he was going to have Mordecai executed and then enjoy a lovely meal with the king and queen. Instead, he spent the day honoring the man he hates most in the world, been humiliated in front of the entire city, and now he has to pretend everything is fine while dining with royalty. But Haman has no idea that the worst is yet to come. He thinks this day can't get any more devastating. But honey, Esther is about to drop a bomb that will change everything. So the king and Haman come to banquet with Queen Esther. The atmosphere is probably elegant and refined, with the finest food and wine, beautiful decorations, soft music, everything perfectly arranged by our strategic queen. On the second day, at the banquet of wine, The king again asks Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." This is it, girl. This is the moment Esther has been building toward. She's had 2 opportunities to make small talk or ask for something trivial, but she's been waiting for this perfect moment to reveal the truth. The king is relaxed, he's feeling generous, and he's clearly very pleased with his queen. And now Esther, with incredible courage and wisdom, delivers one of the most powerful speeches in the entire Bible. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." Let me break down the brilliance of this speech for you. First, she starts by appealing to the king's affection for her. "If I have found favor in your sight." She's reminding him that he loves her and wants to make her happy. Then she reveals that her own life is at stake. "Let my life be given me at my petition." This isn't about other people. This is about his beloved queen being in mortal danger. Next, she mentions "my people," which is the first hint about her true identity, though she hasn't explicitly said she's Jewish yet. Then she uses the king's own language from Haman's original proposal to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. She's throwing Haman's words right back at him. Finally, she shows that she's not being dramatic or unreasonable. She says if it were just about slavery, she wouldn't have bothered the king. But this is about complete extermination. The king is probably sitting there in shock, trying to process what his beloved queen just said. His wife, the woman he loves more than the other women in his empire, is telling him that someone has ordered her death? So King Ahasuerus asks, who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And this, honey, is the moment we've all been waiting for. Esther looks directly at Haman and says, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Can you imagine the silence that must have fallen over that banquet hall? The shock, the tension, the absolute drama of it all? Haman, who thought he was dining as an honored guest, suddenly realizes he's been exposed as a would-be murderer of the queen. The Bible says that Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Terrified. This man who had been so confident, so arrogant, so sure of his power, suddenly realizes that all his schemes have been exposed, and he's facing the wrath of the most powerful man in the world. The king is so furious that he gets up from the banquet in his wrath and goes out to the palace garden. He needs a moment to process what he's just learned. His trusted advisor, the man he elevated above all others, has been plotting to murder his beloved wife. Meanwhile, Haman realizes that his fate is sealed. He can see the king's fury, and he knows there's no way out of the situation. So he stays behind to plead for his life from Queen Esther because he can see that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returns from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, he finds Haman fallen across the couch where Esther was. Now, Haman was probably just desperately trying to beg for mercy, but in Persian culture, it was absolutely forbidden for any man other than the king to touch the queen or even get that close to her. The king sees this and cries out, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As soon as these words leave the king's mouth, the attendants cover Haman's face, which was the Persian way of indicating that someone was about to be executed. It's over for Haman. There's no coming back from this. Then one of the eunuchs, Harbona, speaks up and says, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Girl, the irony is just perfect. The very gallows that Haman built to execute Mordecai is now going to be used for his own execution. The king immediately says, hang him on it. So they hang Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Talk about divine justice. The evil he planned for others came back on his own head in the most dramatic way possible. And the Bible says that after Haman's execution, the king's wrath subsided. Justice had been served, and the immediate threat to the queen had been eliminated. On that same day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Think about that. Esther now owns all of Haman's wealth and property, and Mordecai comes before the king because Esther has finally revealed how he's related to her. The king takes off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gives it to Mordecai. Basically, he's making Mordecai his new prime minister. The man who was supposed to be executed is now the second most powerful person in the empire. And Esther sets Mordecai over the house of Haman. So now Mordecai is not only the king's right-hand man, but he's also managing all of Haman's former wealth and property. Talk about a promotion! But even though Haman is dead and the immediate crisis seems to be over, there's still a massive problem. Remember that unchangeable decree that went out to all 127 provinces, ordering the destruction of all Jewish people on the 13th day of the 12th month? That decree is still in effect, and according to Persian law, it can't be revoked. So Esther goes back to the king again. She falls down at his feet and pleads with him with tears to reverse the evil of Haman and his plot against the Jews. The king holds out the golden scepter to her again, and she stands up and makes her request. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. She continues with one of the most heart-wrenching pleas in Scripture. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? The king tells Esther and Mordecai that while he can't revoke the original decree, because Persian laws are unchangeable once they're written and sealed, he can give them permission to write another decree in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. So Mordecai writes a new decree that basically gives the Jewish people permission to defend themselves. The new law states that the Jews in every city can gather together and protect their lives, and they can destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force that would assault them, including little children and women, and they can plunder their enemies' possessions. This counter-decree is to take effect on the same day as Haman's original decree, the 13th day of the 12th month. So instead of being a day of destruction for the Jews, it becomes a day when they're legally authorized to defend themselves against anyone who tries to harm them. The decree is written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring, making it just as unchangeable and official as Haman's original decree. Then it's sent out by couriers on horseback to all 127 provinces in the empire. And honey, the contrast between how these two decrees were received is incredible. When Haman's decree went out, the city of Susa was confused and distressed. But when Mordecai's counter-decree goes out, there's celebration everywhere. The Bible says that Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and city where the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Can you imagine this transformation? Just months earlier, the Jewish people were facing extinction, mourning in sackcloth and ashes, fasting and weeping. Now they're celebrating, feasting, and their neighbors are so impressed by their God's protection that many are converting to Judaism. This is what happens when God fights for his people, honey. He doesn't just deliver them from their enemies. He turns their mourning into dancing, their sorrow into joy, and their shame into honor. But the story isn't over yet. The 13th day of the 12th month is still coming, and everyone knows it's going to be a day of reckoning. When the 13th day of the 12th month arrives, both decrees are in effect. Haman's original decree gives people permission to attack and destroy the Jews, but Mordecai's counter decree gives the Jews permission to defend themselves and destroy anyone who attacks them. And you know what happens? The Jews completely dominate their enemies. The Bible says that no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. Even the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. In Susa alone, the Jews killed 500 men, plus the 10 sons of Haman. When the king asks Esther if there's anything else she wants, she requests permission for the Jews in Susa to continue defending themselves for one more day, and she asks that Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Throughout the entire empire, the Jews kill 75,000 of their enemies. But, importantly, they don't take any of the plunder, even though the decree gave them permission to. This shows that they weren't motivated by greed or revenge, but simply by the need to protect themselves and their families. After their victory, the Jews establish an annual celebration to commemorate their deliverance. They call it Purim, named after the pur, the lots, that Haman had cast to determine the day of their destruction. Mordecai writes down all these events and sends letters to all the Jews throughout the empire, telling them to observe the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar every year as days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. The Bible says these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, so that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. And you know what? Jewish people still celebrate Purim today, over 2,400 years later. Every year they read the book of Esther, give gifts to friends and charity to the poor, and celebrate how God turned their sorrow into joy and their mourning into gladness. The book of Esther ends by telling us that King Ahasuerus imposed tribute throughout the land and to the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. But the real legacy of this story isn't just about political power or historical events. It's about what happens when ordinary people choose extraordinary courage in the face of impossible circumstances. Okay, honey, now that we've walked through this incredible story together, let's talk about what it means for your life today. Because trust me, the lessons from Queen Esther are just as relevant now as they were 2,400 years ago. First, let's talk about divine timing and purpose. Remember when Mordecai asked Esther, "Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Girl, that question isn't just for ancient queens, it's for you too. Think about your life right now. Where has God positioned you? What relationships do you have? What skills have you developed? What platforms do you have access to? What challenges are you facing that might actually be opportunities to make a difference? Maybe you're in a difficult job, but you're there for such a time as this to be a light to your coworkers. Maybe you're going through a season of struggle, but you're being prepared for such a time as this to help others who will face similar challenges. Maybe you have influence in your friend group, your family, your community, and you're there for such a time as this to speak truth, show love, or stand up for what's right. The beautiful truth is that nothing in your life is wasted. Every experience, every relationship, every skill, every struggle, God can use it all for his purposes and for the good of others. Second, let's talk about courage in the face of fear. Esther was terrified to approach the king uninvited. She knew she could die, but she chose courage anyway, saying, "If I perish, I perish." Honey, we all have moments when we need to choose courage over comfort. Maybe it's having that difficult conversation with a friend who's making destructive choices, standing up to a bully at work or school, ending a toxic relationship even though you're scared of being alone, pursuing that dream that feels too big or too risky, speaking up about injustice even when it's unpopular, sharing your faith with someone even when you're nervous about their reaction. The truth is, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling the fear and choosing to do the right thing anyway. Esther felt the fear and did it anyway. You can too. Third, let's talk about the power of preparation and wisdom. Esther didn't just barge into the throne room and blurt out her request. She fasted and prayed for 3 days. She strategically planned 2 banquets. She waited for the perfect timing to reveal the truth. In your own life, when you're facing big decisions or challenges, pray about it first. Seek God's wisdom and timing. Get wise counsel from people you trust. Think strategically about the best way to approach the situation. Don't rush into action just because you're emotional or impatient. Wait for God's timing, even when it's hard. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is wait for the right moment to speak truth or take action. Fourth, let's talk about using your influence for good. Esther could have stayed quiet and tried to protect herself. She had a comfortable life as queen, and speaking up put all of that at risk. But she realized that with privilege comes responsibility. What influence do you have in your circles? Maybe you think you don't have much, but I bet you have more than you realize. Your voice in your family dynamics, your influence over your children or younger siblings, your platform on social media, even if it's just your friends and family, your position at work or school, your role in your church or community groups. How can you use whatever influence you have to stand up for others, speak truth, show love, or make positive change? Fifth, let's talk about identity and authenticity. Esther had to keep her Jewish identity secret for a season, but when the time came, she had the courage to reveal who she really was, even though it was risky. Are there parts of your authentic self that you're hiding because you're afraid of rejection or judgment? Your faith, your values, your dreams, your struggles, your story. I'm not saying you need to share everything with everyone. Wisdom and discernment are important. But don't spend your whole life hiding who God made you to be because you're afraid of what people might think. Sixth, let's talk about trusting God's sovereignty even when things look hopeless. When Haman's decree went out, it probably looked like the end for the Jewish people. But God was already working behind the scenes, through Esther's position, through the king's insomnia, through the forgotten record of Mordecai's good deed. When your situation looks hopeless, remember that God is still working. He's still sovereign. He's still good. He can turn any situation around in ways you never could have imagined. Finally, let's talk about celebration and gratitude. After God delivered them, the Jewish people didn't just say thanks and move on. They established an annual celebration that they still observe today. They made sure future generations would remember what God had done. How are you celebrating what God has done in your life? How are you remembering His faithfulness? How are you sharing those stories with others who might need hope? So how do you practically live out these lessons? Here are some concrete ways to channel your inner Esther. Start with prayer and fasting. When you're facing a big decision or challenge, follow Esther's example. Set aside time to fast and pray, asking God for wisdom, courage, and His timing. Invite trusted friends to pray with you. Identify your "for such a time as this" moments. Look at your current circumstances, relationships, and opportunities. Ask God to show you how He might want to use your unique position to make a difference for others. Practice courage in small things. You don't have to start by approaching kings. Practice courage in everyday situations. Speaking up when someone tells a harmful joke. Offering help to someone in need. Having honest conversations with people you love. Build your wisdom and strategic thinking. Read books, seek mentors, learn from other women who've shown courage and wisdom in their own "for such a time as this" moments. Study how Jesus handled difficult situations. Use your platforms purposefully. Whether it's social media, your workplace, your family, or your friend group, think intentionally about how you can use your influence to encourage, protect, and empower others. Connect with your community. Esther didn't act alone. She had Mordecai's guidance and the prayers of her people. Surround yourself with people who will encourage you to be brave and hold you accountable to your values. Remember that God can use your story, your struggles, your victories, your journey. It's all part of a bigger story that God can use to encourage and help others. Don't hide your testimony. Here's the beautiful truth that runs through the entire book of Esther. God is always working even when you can't see him. Did you notice that God's name is never explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther, but his presence and his providence are evident on every page? He's working through seemingly coincidental events, through people's choices, through timing that seems too perfect to be random. That's exactly how God works in your life too, honey. He's not always speaking from burning bushes or parting seas. More often, he's working through the conversation that changes your perspective, the opportunity that comes at just the right time, the person who speaks truth into your life when you need it most, the door that closes, protecting you from something harmful, the strength you find when you thought you had none left. The same God who positioned Esther to save her people is positioning you for the purposes he has for your life. He's writing your story with the same care, the same love, and the same power. You might not be a queen in a palace, but you are a daughter of the King of Kings. You might not have an empire to influence, but you have a sphere of influence that matters. You might not be facing a genocide, but you're facing your own challenges that require courage, wisdom, and faith. And just like Esther, you're not alone in any of it. The same God who gave her favor with the king will give you favor where you need it. The same God who gave her wisdom in her timing will give you wisdom in yours. The same God who turned her situation from tragedy to triumph can do the same for you. Girl, as we finish this story together, I want you to know that Queen Esther's courage lives on in every woman who chooses faith over fear, purpose over comfort, and others over self. Maybe you're reading this in your own for such a time as this moment. Maybe you're facing a decision that scares you, a challenge that feels too big, or an opportunity that requires more courage than you think you have. Remember Esther's words, "If I perish, I perish." She counted the cost and decided that some things are worth the risk. What is God calling you to risk for the sake of love, justice, truth, or his purposes? Remember Mordecai's faith. Relief and deliverance will arise from another place. Even if you don't act, God is still sovereign and his purposes will prevail. But what if he wants to use you as part of his rescue plan? Remember the transformation. What started as a story of potential genocide became a story of celebration and deliverance that's still remembered thousands of years later. God specializes in turning stories of despair into stories of hope. Your story matters, honey. Your choices matter. Your courage matters. You are positioned where you are for such a time as this. So put on your crown. Not because you're perfect, but because you're chosen. Walk into your throne room, not because you're not afraid, but because you're trusting the King who loves you. Speak your truth, not because it's easy, but because it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. The same God who was with Esther is with you. And honey, that changes everything. Now go live like the queen you are for such a time as this.